Greetings. This is the 13th of the Dr. Oba T'Shaka shows. The topic for this morning is Trump, white militias, and the right-wing sedition at the nation's capital. This is the third of a series of two that have already been done, two of them with Dr. Akinyele Umoja being a part of the presentation. He won't be with us today, and so this is the third of this series. And this series is going to focus on right-wing militias with an emphasis on this demonstration that has occurred, this attempted coup that has occurred at the nation's capital, January the 6th, 2021. So we've been dealing with resistance traditions among African people, and then how those armed resistance traditions have carried over into the United States. Part one was on the African armed resistance tradition, and part two was on the armed resistance traditions in the United States, focusing on the armed resistance traditions in Mississippi and using Dr. Akinyele Umoja's book, We'll Shoot Back. So this third is going to focus on the right wing with a special emphasis on right-wing militias. This is important so that we understand the background of what's happened in Washington, D.C. on the 6th in the Capitol. But more important, that we understand the nature of these forces and what they represent, the threat that they pose, and you can begin to have better ideas on how you handle this. Now, to really understand what I'm going through today, it's important that people should go back and look at, and I mean seriously look at, the second Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show, which was originally entitled Lessons from Post-Reconstruction for Voting Trump Out of the White House into the Jailhouse. And that we have literally accomplished. He's heading for some kind of jailhouse, and right now impeachment for the second time, at least in the House of Representatives. This show has been retitled. If you go back to my shows, the second show, it's now retitled How Black Power Produced the Military Defeat of the Confederacy, Segregation, and Trump. And these are very historic victories that Blacks secured, first in freeing ourselves from slavery, because literally Blacks won the Civil War. It's only when Blacks entered the Civil War did the Union armies begin to have decisive victories. So that's covered in depth in this second show that you should watch. And it has beautiful historical footage. And as a number of people have said, this is something that 10, 12, 11, 13-year-olds would understand. And it really gives you a sense of your power. And it is really the first defeat that whites suffered at our hands, because we were the balance of power in that war before our entry into the Civil War as armed soldiers. The North had virtually no defeats, no victories. And after our entry, continuous victories. And that was because Blacks had a reason to fight, and also because we're good fighters, but especially when you're securing something which is the end of chattel slavery. So you should look at this, because this really gives you the understanding for a deeper look at what we're going to be talking about today. And the emphasis on our victory in the Civil War and then subsequent victories rendered against white supremacy in this country place a special emphasis on the strategic position of Africans in the United States, something that most of us do not appreciate. In fact, as I pointed out before, our biggest weakness as a people is that we don't understand our greatest strength, which is our culture, and which happens to arise from liberation movements that are expressions of culture, freedom movements. And those are the high points of our culture. So to understand what we're covering today, it's very important to really understand what happened at the nation's capital on January the 6th, 2021, and the various right-wing attacks that we've seen coming against the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements historically, a number of killings and murders that have occurred in this country, in this particular case at the hands of the right wing. Now, if we're going to understand the background of this historically, then the first thing to understand is that what the media has been saying, and many of the so-called political leaders have been saying, that what's happened in the Capitol is an exception, that America is a noble experiment, and that this is the exception. The mad people have taken over. But if we are to really look at our history, we see that our history is really founded upon violence. It's founded upon terrorism. There's a great European historian, his name is Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee made the observation, and he was born in 1852 in Britain. He was an economic historian, and his observation of the United States is much more truthful than what the media has been portraying as the so-called real history and real culture of America. And what he said is, America is the only society that has gone from savagery to barbarism without experiencing one day of civilization. And that's the truth. And I think most viewers know what that meant, but for the few that may not, what he meant was the system that's set up in this country that people call white supremacy or racism and capitalism was founded upon savagery. And what was that savagery? The first, and barbarism. What was the savagery and barbarism? The systematic extermination of 90% of the occupants of this land, Native Americans. And that was a project engaged in by the masses of whites, as well as by the military and the federal government. Now, this isn't the only society that did that. Australia did it, a few other places in the world. In fact, genocide has followed European conquest in many parts of the world. But this country was founded on that, genocide. And then we know the country was founded upon enslavement, the enslavement of African people. And we literally built the country. In fact, the White House that the occupants exercised an attempted coup over was built by enslaved Africans. And in fact, the Capitol was laid out by Benjamin Banneker, the best astronomer and the creator of the most accurate almanac at that time, better than Thomas Jefferson's. So Africans have certainly been at the foundation of building the country, but we have also experienced the savagery and barbarism, not to mention the millions of Blacks lost in the Middle Passage. And then we know, of course, America was founded on the theft of land from Mexico. 1840, the War of 1846 through 1848, where this country went in to Mexico, a country that had eliminated slavery. And that was one of the objections that they had to that country, but a country that didn't have the kind of forces to defend itself against the United States, and the United States went in and ripped off northern Mexico. And so what's called the border that many supporters of Trump want to protect is actually stolen land. California, New Mexico, Arizona, a host of other areas stolen from Mexico. And Grant would later become General of the Army of the United States and later President of the United States, called this the Dirty War. Of course, he participated in it. So this country has been based on land theft and then the impoverishment of a large sector of this people, including whites. But America's had a very interesting way of handling this. So to understand what happened in the Capitol and the violence exercised by militia groups, we need to understand the violence that this country is founded on, and to understand the violence of the right wing, and particularly militia groups, is to understand that that's about as American as apple pie. Dr. Akinyele Umoja, when he was discussing armed resistance traditions among African Americans, and I was as well, we pointed out how difficult it's been for Africans in this country to carry out armed resistance because of the nature of the violence in the hands of whites. But there's a history to that. And I'm not going into all of it, but this background is very important to understand the armed militias movements today. And the key thing to understand is in the policies that the American government erected against Blacks when it came to exercising armed resistance. And this begins in Bacon's Rebellion, B-A-C-O-N, which occurred in Jamestown, Virginia, 1676. Now that's not long after the so-called Pilgrims arrived and the first Africans who were at least brought into this country as servants and then later became slaves arrived, not long after. And Jamestown, Virginia, and Virginia itself was like the center point of colonial occupation in this country. Bacon's rebellion was a rebellion that posed a serious threat to the people colonizing this country. And it was a serious threat because it was a rebellion by three groups: frontiersmen, which Bacon was a part of, he was also a landowner, white servants, and enslaved Africans. The two things that the people that ruled this country feared most was the alliance of Blacks and whites and the alliance of Blacks and Native Americans. These were the two things they feared most because, especially in the founding of this country, whites were at times in certain parts of the United States, such as South Carolina, a minority. And if either of these two groups combined, the colonizers could lose power. And at this point, it would be the British, but it would also be the elite of whites who were also benefiting off of this colonial system. So this rebellion was raised up on a number of issues. The first one was anti-Native American, because Bacon was arguing that the colonial government had not pursued the policy of attacking Native Americans effectively. So while he led a rebellion that was threatening to colonial powers, he was himself anti-Indian, as were the masses of whites in this country. So that was in part the frontiersmen who were saying, you're giving us land up here, but you're not pursuing and killing enough Native Americans. So that was one objection. But the other objection was that there was a huge tax that had been imposed on the people in the colony. And the biggest tax was the tobacco tax. And there were some 40 British tobacco owners who controlled this. And so while the farmers were white enslaved Africans and indentured servants, the profits went almost completely to 40 people. So it's 40,000 Jamestown people who were being exploited by 40. And even the governor of Jamestown, Virginia, admitted such. So this rebellion was a serious one. And it was so serious that the governor had to flee Jamestown because the capital was burning. The British felt so threatened that they sent in 1,000 troops, which was a lot at that time, given the size of the population of this country that wasn't that great. And that was to maintain the position of British colonialism and British power. Bacon's rebellion was put down. It was defeated. And what happens there has a lot to do with what we call armed policy of this government towards armed groups, white and blacks. So since there was the threat of blacks and whites literally seizing power, there was also another threat, and this was a threat called leveling. And this was a term that whites had. Leveling meant equalizing the distribution of wealth, something that the founding fathers also created and built a federal system to prevent. So that was another objective of this rebellion that the colonizers feared, and those who were white who had a lot of property in this country. So once this rebellion is defeated, then what happens is when white indentured servants are free, they are given guns, they are given a certain amount of money and corn, some food. And they are not prosecuted for having engaged in this rebellion. Blacks are returned to enslavement, and blacks not only are not allowed to arm, but the whites who had been their allies are now used to be patrollers, to police blacks, and they're paid for it. They're not paid a lot. These are poor whites. So the point is, when we're talking about armed resistance, whites have been armed to the teeth. And by the way, the governor of Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, had stated that one of the things that really bothered him about the rebellion was that you had poor people who were armed. And at that point, he was as much concerned about poor whites being armed as poor blacks or enslaved blacks. But the point is that when this rebellion is suppressed and whites are brought on board to police blacks, then what happens is you begin this policy of whiteness. And so what distinguishes a person from Europe, starting with Britain, coming into the United States, is the color of their skin. And in this case, they're given the power to manage blacks on behalf of those who are oppressing them, because they're not freed from their poverty, which was extreme. But they at least get the privilege of not being black and or red and later brown. So this is the basis for the disarming policies, or the policies that sought to see that blacks would have no arms, because especially during enslavement, an armed black is of course going to be a freedom fighter. And that would be the policy as well after the end of enslavement, after the winning of the Civil War, largely through the actions of blacks. So we see the root of whiteness occurring out of this system. Now, slave patrols, slave rebellions, and what historians call petty maroonage. Petty maroonage is referring to slaves who escaped from enslavement. or running away from slavery. These were the main things that the colonizers and the enslavers feared most. Uh, that is, slave rebellions and petty maroonage. Um, and so when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, giving blacks the incentive to fight, of course, blacks are armed. Blacks are armed at this point because now it's in the interest of whites to have blacks armed. Nearly 170,000 blacks fighting in the Civil War. Um, so that is the distinction. We're armed when it serves the interests of this country, but when it doesn't, the policy is to disarm us. And this is, of course, true for subsequent wars. We can go off and, if we are brainwashed enough for whatever reason, kill Vietnamese, but don't come back and use those same arms to arm against white militias or to defend yourself against white violence in general. Um, and we know during the Reconstruction period, you did have armed militias, black armed militias in the South. But those black armed militias were not as well armed as those that went up against them. Um, Dr. Akinyele Umoja in his analysis showed you that in Mississippi, you had black towns in Mississippi that had been organized by African secret societies in Mississippi. And these African secret societies had self-defense systems. So that was a key reason that they could keep those towns under black control. He also showed you that during the Black Freedom Movement, a key reason that the Black Freedom Movement could be successful was that there were enclaves of either all black towns where blacks not only controlled the land, controlled the economy, but defended those towns. And those were enclaves where blacks could go for protection. So this is again showing you the way in which armed self-defense worked, and it worked subtly. Because if you noted in Dr. Akinyele Umoja's analysis in the second show, he stumbled on this. He stumbled on this information, and people who were telling him about secret orders, once they found out that he wasn't a member of them, they shut up because it's the nature of secret societies. But it was, again, this armed resistance tradition, in this case, intelligently organized, that enabled a movement to have the free room to organize. And this should tell us something today as well. A white historian named Herbert Aptheker, who wrote a book on slave rebellion showing over 250, there were probably many more, in his research on Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, what he showed was that blacks in 13 different documents that he had uncovered had been engaging in planning and organizing self-defense movements during Reconstruction, where blacks had some kind of political power, and then post-Reconstruction, where blacks were under the gun, or what the grassroots would call being bulldozed, or literally burned out or lynched or whatever. And he showed that there were active plans and organizing underway in cities like Baltimore, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and Kansas. And Kansas would be real important because during post-Reconstruction, when blacks are under attack, a lot of blacks leave the South and form towns in Kansas. Again, self-defense went along with it. Now, it's normally assumed that the protection of blacks in the South ends with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1876. That's a compromise that I referred to in this second show that I'm recommending that you check out. And that was a close presidential election. And it went to the House of Representatives. And in the end, Rutherford B. Hayes became president on condition of withdrawing federal troops. And as I pointed out in the film, appointing two Southerners to the Supreme Court that would erase civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. What's generally missed in that analysis is that by 1876, only 3 states had federal troops occupying them. The rest of the states of the South were under white control. Vigilante action in the form of the Ku Klux Klan had removed Reconstruction legislatures. So this notion that it's 1876 in which Blacks lose their protection is wrong. And Blacks continue to defend themselves, but greatly outnumbered. So when we look at the Klan and looking at white groups, white militia groups, the Klan is first that you should look at, but they're not the primary actors today. But they perform the role of playing the foundation at white terrorism at the end of the Civil War. And so in 1876, you have the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, but you have the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866. And General Bedford Forrest, who had been a Confederate general, ended up being appointed or elected by former Confederates as the head of the Klan. And the Klan went on a terror expedition throughout the South. And that was from 1866 on. And this is the force that Blacks had to fight against. And once federal troops are withdrawn, and in some cases, Blacks are encouraged to even give up the weapons they have, which they refuse to, then what you have is this period of terror that goes down into this first period of the Klan, which is a period that goes from 1866 until the end of World War I. This is the first phase of the Klan. The second phase of the Klan is from the end of World War I until 1954. And this is again a period of terrorism. And this is a period also in which the film The Birth of a Nation comes in a little earlier and portrays whites as being overrun by Blacks who are out to rape white women and who don't know how to do anything when it comes to running governments. When in fact, in Reconstruction governments, Blacks who occupied positions in state legislatures and in the Senate of the United States and the Congress of the United States enacted the first free public education laws in the South that benefited whites and Blacks, and carried out a number of other legislative measures that benefited not only Blacks, but everybody else. So, but what we see with these two periods of the rise of the Klan, this is the period of the rise of the ascendancy of white power, not just in this country, but in the world. So I point out in this film that I go into greater depths on, this was a period where it was a high tide of white power. And I would say at that time, the term white supremacy is appropriate. Britain ruled the world for 300 years. America would begin to rise to power at the end of World War I. And because Britain would become a debtor nation owing its debt to the United States. And by World War II, it would exercise supreme power in the world, but would only exercise it for 27 years. America has probably gone through the most rapid decline of any world power in human history, largely because they faced a high tide of the rise of Africa, the rise of Asia, the rise of little old Cuba off the shores of Florida, which becomes a high tide that's very difficult to resist. This does not mean that Africa is fully free. We know that Africa is in trouble because it inherited the European nation state because of the damage and ravage done by colonialism and slavery. Africans will take longer to get their act together, but they broke free from colonialism. That was because of the weakened nature of Western power caused by 2 world wars. And so you see the rise of China, you see the rise of Africa, and China now posing a threat to the preeminent power of the United States. Technically, today, the term white supremacy does not quite fit the power position of America because now America is in a position of decline. It is still the foremost military power, but it is ravaged with all kinds of problems inside this country in terms of oppression, with the rich getting rich and the poor getting poor, rundown roads, bridges that are collapsing, schools that only work for the rich and the whites, and I'm talking about the rich whites, and a system that a good friend of mine, Kendi Solowazi, calls a failed state. And I think it's an interesting concept to think about because now you have a government that doesn't work. And as a result, both the pandemic that is killing probably millions of people, the figures you have that are over 350,000 deaths, they're now saying it's probably 4 times that number, which would be well over 1 million people who have died by the pandemic because of the unwillingness of an ignorant president to take the most basic measures to preserve the lives of their people. So we are in a period of decline of power in the United States, though still, this country still has the strongest military power and its economic power is still the greatest. It's in decline. America can no longer snap its finger and the world jumps as they could when Britain ruled the waves and America tried to for 27 years. So when we look at the Klan, we got, and then the right wing that comes out of that, and in this case, the right wing militia that's violent, and then other wings that, claim to be not violent, but pursue the same policies. What we see is that these movements operate in a different historical context. And the historical context for this period is marked by 2 things. One, the 1954 Supreme Court decision. And in that decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, it's decided that segregation is not equal. Separate but equal is not equal. And the Supreme Court declares that these schools need to be desegregated. The key point is that's a blow to the backward forces of white supremacy. Now, the forces that issue these rulings are also maintaining white supremacy, the Supreme Court and the corporations and others that run the country. But the key point is this is the beginning of a change. And in this particular case, this decision reflects the fact that segregation is embarrassing on a global level for the United States. At a time of decolonization, to have the brutal systems that continue to operate in the South makes it difficult for America to claim to be a leader of the so-called free world. So in that sense, the Supreme Court decision of 1954 represents a concession by the ruling powers that some things need to be changed. But the key thing about this third period for the Klan and for the right wing, because my focus isn't mainly on the Klan, but for here, it's the foundation for this discussion of this new paramilitary. The central thing that the new right wing, and including the armed militia, has to face is that their behinds were kicked, that they suffered a serious defeat starting in 1955 and going through the 60s. Black people scored a major victory against white apartheid, starting in Montgomery, where 97% of Black people stood for a year against this system and brought it down. In this case, segregation in the buses, but then later the student sit-ins, the demonstrations across the South, particularly Birmingham and Selma, produced both civil rights legislation that includes job provisions, the right of Blacks and people of color to the access of jobs, and voting rights legislation that comes out of Selma. As I pointed out, I was a March Marshal in the Selma to Montgomery March and was arrested in Selma. So this is a serious defeat to white power in this country, particularly so-called white supremacy. Many of us, particularly in the movement at that time, didn't give ourselves enough credit for what had been achieved, particularly the militant wing of the movement. It was focusing more on the tactics of the movement, which Northerners had problems with nonviolence, and failing often to see the serious victory that our people had achieved. I think we've come to see that. And so this is a victory because with the civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation, it means that you cannot just simply continue to strip Blacks of the right to vote, though you will continue to try and do it through illegal means, which we have seen in this election and previous elections. And it's going to be hard to just restrict Blacks from pursuing other opportunities in the area of employment, education, housing, and other things, which we had been frozen out of, particularly the housing market, frozen out of it. For years, not able to buy a home under federal financing, and therefore restricting our accumulation of wealth. So this was an extremely important victory because it meant that the reinstitution of enslavement that occurred in the post-Reconstruction period with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise had been overturned. It didn't mean that the mentalities hadn't changed, and it certainly did not mean that whites had lost their power. Whites still controlled the military, the political, and the economic systems. However, they had been put into a corner, and they had been put into a corner by a movement led by man by and woman by Black folks, and then having considerable support from white youth, some white liberals, and the world. And this was an extremely important point. Now, this then ushers in the third phase of the armed militias and white supremacist groups. And this phase is characterized by a psychological attitude that I discussed when I talked about the Civil War in greater detail. And that's the attitude of dispossession. This is very important to understand. The Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Three Percenters, and the others that you have seen, Black Lives Matter rallies and others, and you saw in the nation's capital, they are plagued by the psychological attitude of defeat, that they who are supposed to be supreme were defeated by soul brothers and sisters who aren't supposed to have any brains. You know, the first thing in war is two rules: know your enemy, know yourself. And it's the same mistake that whites made in Vietnam. They didn't study the history of Vietnam. If you studied it, you'd know that that's one of the worst places in the world for you to try and wage a war against, because the Vietnamese have defeated every conqueror, every one. The Chinese tried, they were defeated, you know. The Japanese were in for a while, they were thrown out, the French as well. But they didn't know their enemy, which really was not the enemy of the American people. They made them the enemy. So this has been the problem for the right wing, and the problem for a majority of whites who have this mentality that blacks are inferior, this idea of racism, which is based on two premises. The inferiority of a group, in this case, based on color, and the movement to oppress that group. There are two requirements for racism. To have only one does not make it racist, particularly just the attitude without the oppression. It might be a mentality there, but there's a system that has backed this up. And it has led some blacks to say that blacks are racist too. Well, I could argue that the only factual basis for that might be some of the damage we do to each other. That might be self-hatred. But show me a white person we've lynched. Show me white people that we've oppressed in this country. And I would say that most of us don't have the mentality of racism to begin with. So when we're looking at this third period, dispossession characterizes it. And it means that whites feel dispossessed because they realize they no longer have complete power and complete control. So that's the first basis for dispossession. And when we get into Trump, I should say, he has a mentality of dispossession. He has a mentality of people are out to get him. A mentality that somebody took something from him, when in fact he was too dumb to figure out how to win. Like had he done something on COVID, it might have been very difficult to defeat him. Since you had a whole lot of white people in this country saying they didn't like how the federal government handled COVID, but at the same time they said Trump wasn't to blame, when in fact Trump had done everything possible to kill people, which was nothing. He did literally nothing. So had he followed Bannon, one of his main former advisors, a true racist but smart, he said in January, get your hands on this and your presidency is secured. But he was too dumb, too uncaring, too insensitive. And as Woodward said, when he had studied him before, he said, because he had written another book on him before this latest one, he said, I hope he never faces a crisis. Because it's one thing to fly in a plane on automatic pilot when you don't know how to fly the plane. Hopefully somebody's there to land it. But it's another thing to occupy a presidency that's been on automatic pilot, where literally all you've been doing is tweeting for 4 years, playing golf, eating McDonald's hamburgers, and listening to Fox News. That's one thing. But when you're faced with a crisis that requires expertise that you don't have, then woe is to everyone that has to face that. So the Donald feels dispossessed. He feels dispossessed of the presidency. And guess who dispossessed him? We did. Pat yourself on the back. You hear me? Brown people did. Red people, 99% of the Navajo people in Arizona voted against Trump. Now that's the most intelligent vote carried out by anybody. Our group voted 87% against him, but 99%, you understand? And that's why Native Americans are our natural allies, by the way. So we have to understand dispossession as the key quality of the mentality of the right wing. They've been dispossessed. And that comes through the defeat that they faced at our hands. Now, so when we look at the Klan, when they organized in the 70s, they organized different from the way they organized in the first two periods of Klan organization. And that organization would influence how militias would organize as well. Not that they had to follow them, but they would follow a similar course. And so one of the questions that the Klan has to answer, and it's also a question that the right wing in general has to answer, is the question of how did so-called superior whites get defeated by blacks? This is a real big question for them. I mean, haven't you noticed anytime we get into a battle, we win? I mean, you notice that? I mean, you study any history, whether it's in the boxing ring or the military ring or the political ring, haven't you noticed, So part of this answer and part of the reshaping of the right wing that influences what happened on the Capitol, that influences the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the 3%ers, and others, are the writings of a person named William Pierce. William Pierce, in 1978, wrote a book under the name of Andrew McDonald. And the book was entitled The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries really have a major influence on both the new Klan and the right wing and the armed militia that comes later. Now, it's not the sole influence, but it's a major influence. And Turner's book, which is 200 pages long and which sold 500,000 copies. And these copies have been read by white supremacist groups, including white militia groups. This is a Bible for them. And basically, what the Turner Diaries assert is that, and it's a mythical, it's a novel. And so you might dismiss it because you'll say, oh, it's a novel. It's not true. Well, guess what? These white people who are in Washington to overturn the Electoral College and the popular vote, they were also dealing with mythology that the election had been stolen. Told to them by Trump, but which many of them would probably believe anyway. And so don't think that because something isn't true, it doesn't have an influence on people, or because it's a novel. Sometimes novels capture more truth than real life. But in this particular case, there's a reason for the Turner Diaries having a major influence on the white militia movement and the white right wing. In the Turner Diaries, the essence of it is this, that a protagonist in the book is being oppressed by a multicultural nation that oppresses him, the hero, but oppresses white men and strips them of their manhood. And the police force, which is also described as a multicultural police force, is also being used to oppress the masses of whites, especially, of course, white men. And of course, white womanhood is being deflowered, as is the myth of the Klan that blacks are out raping white women. So this is the storyline. And this storyline, while it may appear to be fanciful and not true, this book was written in 1978. It certainly has certain elements of truth in it. For example, for Turner, what he calls the multicultural government is the government of a Lyndon Johnson and a Jimmy Carter, but especially a Lyndon Johnson, because it's under Johnson that the civil rights and voting rights laws are passed. And as a result of that, some federal policies are enacted that are viewed by the right wing as favoring blacks over whites and people of color over whites. Of course, over their right to oppress blacks. So this is the basis for that. And that is the perception of a body of whites in this country. By the way, there was a woman named Hannah Arendt. She's a Jewish historian, and she wrote a book called The Origin of Totalitarianism. And one of the conclusions she drew in this book was that when the French government enacted laws of equality, making Jews equal to French, that brought them close to extermination. She argued that the idea of equality for Jews led to the perception among the masses of whites in France that the government was favoring Jews over them. And whatever problems they had, they could trace it back to them. And so she argued that the final solution, Hitler's extermination of 6 million Jews, had a lot to do with that perception. Of course, we know it had to do with anti-Semitism, which generally Europeans had anyway. But the point is, there is a perception among a large number of whites who feel that they're entitled, who feel that they're superior, and who are now into the drudgery of loss of jobs, manufacturing jobs, good paying jobs, who are living in Rust Belt areas where life is hard. Part of the blame is on this government that has favored Blacks over them. And part of this thing that you saw in Washington of take the government back is part of that move. And of course, make America great again, which by the way is a Hitler slogan, make Germany great again. And it was also a Reagan slogan. So that was the real thrust there. So that when we look at this notion of dispossession and everything else, it's this thrust that we see coming out of the Black freedom movement that leads to dispossession, that would lead a Turner to write Turner Diaries, which you could call the diary of dispossession. It's really saying that the multicultural government, the government that was really pressured by Blacks, because it's the truth. Blacks pressured Johnson, who had been a racist and was a racist when he implemented these policies, to implement policies favoring Blacks and people of color, favoring us to the point that we were restored the rights that everyone else had, at least on paper. So this is then the appeal of the Turner Diaries. So when the Klan is organized again in the 70s, the Klan begins to organize in a different way. The Klan, under the leadership of a Klansman called David Dukes in the 70s, he reads the Turner Diaries. And so he finds an answer for why did they suffer this defeat at the hands of Blacks, a people who are inferior, of course, the people that gave birth to civilization. The Pythagorean theorem is a theorem that Pythagoras learned in the Kemetic mystery systems. Medicine came from us. Architecture, the greatest architectural monuments. These people who gave birth to civilization somehow are inferior. Well, that's your mistake. But the key point is, when David Duke looks at this, he finds an answer for why they were defeated. And it comes from Pierce and the Turner Diaries. And the answer is, Blacks didn't win this Black freedom movement. It was Jews who were the brains behind that movement. They're the ones who were really pulling the strings in their own interests. And so in the new Klan, Duke comes up with this idea that primary enemy is Jews, and of course it's Blacks and people of color. But the point is, he's revising his ideology to suit this circumstance of defeat and to explain it away. He also decides that he's not going to do like the old Klan and put down Italians or others who happen to be Catholics. They were all white. He's saying, forget about that. We need to unite the white race. So this also becomes a format for his organizing. In the beginning, he wears the robes, but he decides to come out of his robes. Now, he's a history major. He graduated from college. For a white boy, whites would consider him good looking. He's verbal. He can at least keep a complete sentence, unlike the president who's leaving the White House right now. So he goes on television, the Donahue Show. He's on all the major television networks. And what he's doing is creating a new image of the Klan, one that is mainstream and more respectable, but just as violent. And he decides, at a time in which, of course, he's opposed to women's liberation, considers it a Jewish conspiracy, he decides to admit women on a footing of as knights, whereas the Klan that rode in the 1860s and 70s and on, women were just backdrops. They were just fragile things to look on as their men raped and murdered. So now they get a chance to engage in rape and murder. And if you look at these people that went to Capitol, you'll see a lot of white women there. You hear me? Some of them throwing punches. You know what I mean? In fact, one of them was shot, QAnon supporter, who believed in this idea that pedophiles and stuff was, really, behind all the problems that people face in this country. And she was shot as she tried to bust into the Capitol. White women, you understand? And if you look at this last election, 58% of whites voted for Trump. 55% of those were white women. And in fact, more white women voted for Trump this time than the first time, having been ravaged by all kinds of problems caused by Trump. But to them, he was still their father. Or as my niece described it, a white friend of hers said, her king. It just slipped out. She said, Trump's my king. And then she checked herself because she wasn't supposed to be saying this around what was supposed to be her Black friend. So what we see then with the Klan and the organization of the Klan is the Klan begins to organize on a different basis, take the sheet off, put on a suit and tie, and David Duke ends up running for president. And not for president, he ends up running for elective office and actually gets elected, the state elected office for a short period of time. So this defeat that whites face at the hands of Blacks forces them to begin to reorganize in a different way. And one of the things that David Duke does is, and this is real interesting, and a good part of the white militia movement has adopted this, he follows Pierce's Turner Diaries conclusion that shouldn't you be going back to this era of segregation? What you need to do is whites need to separate themselves off and form their own state. Now, this is truly a sense of dispossession. Whereas you've run the whole place, now, you are prepared to go off into an enclave. An interesting idea, But again, it's a part of the psychology of dispossession. Of course, many in the white militia and right-wing movement, some would argue that. Others would argue extermination. And I would say that most, if they could get away with it, would try it. So these are the periods for the right wing. And the Turner Diaries plays a big part in that. Now, if we look at the right wing and particularly the white militia movement in this period now, it has two phases that are really important, or two wings that are really important, that the right wing and particularly militia movement is a part of. One is the mainstream. since the 70s, there's been major reorganization within the right wing as a result of the defeats that they suffered in the 60s and 50s. And so one group in the right wing is made up of people who, whether they're in Congress or in various legislative positions, or, and this is the real important part of this mainstream wing, they are part of think tanks. They are using their power through the vote, through elective office, and through think tanks to shape policies that will become mainstream, policies that would work to reverse voting rights legislation, policies that would try and reverse Brown versus the Board of Education, policies that would reverse abortion decisions, and others. So this is one end of the new right wing. The other are the vanguardists or the armed militia. So you have these two wings that are organized starting in the 70s, early 60s and 70s. And in the shift of these two right wings, there are two major think tanks that play a major role in this. One is a think tank called the Liberty Lobby. The Liberty Lobby is not so influential now, but it plays a very important role in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and down into the 90s up to a certain point. A man named Willis Carto forms the Liberty Lobby. And the Liberty Lobby is about reversing a lot of these gains that have been made by Blacks in the 60s. And the second group is the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is an extremely influential think tank to this day, founded by a man named Ed Flunor. Now, these are important to understand because while the armed militia comes out with the guns, what they're often defending are policies that are being mainstreamed by politicians and by think tanks. And the think tanks are often laying out the policies. Now, these are not the only two think tanks. The Hoover Institute is one. The Hoover Institute provided 80% of Ronald Reagan's policies in his first year. And the Hoover Institute tried to wipe out Black studies when I was chair from 90 to 92. That was the hardest fight we had to preserve Black studies, harder than the strike that took around 8 months to bring in Black studies. It took 2 years to defeat the Hoover Institute, but again, note, we defeated them. You know what I mean? Some of us actually do win. A lot of Black folks have had some victories. So in the case of the Liberty Lobby, the founder of the Liberty Lobby, Willis Carto, he decided when he looked at the victory of the Black freedom movement, voter rights, civil rights legislation, he decided that he would work to try and turn a victory into a defeat. And a key thing, anytime you're engaged in struggle, know your enemy. And don't be running around talking about, oh, how dumb they are, this and that. If they're dumb, they're dumb. But if they aren't, you better acknowledge what they've got going for them. And so what did Carto do? Carto went and made an analysis of where things were going to go. Now, this analysis was partially the same as Lyndon Johnson's on one level. And this analysis would then serve as the basis for the direction of not only his institute, but a lot of the policies that would be recommended, racist policies for the federal government and for the country as a whole. And so what he did is he predicted that with the victory of the Black freedom movement whites would leave the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson had predicted the same thing. He also predicted that blacks would make up the Democratic Party in the South. It would become a black party in the South. And he argued then that the Republican Party would be the party for defending white rights. And the Democratic Party would be the party that would defend black interests. That's, of course, how he phrased it. Now, his predictions partially true, partially false. It's correct. Whites left the Democratic Party because of the victory of blacks in the Black Freedom Movement. They saw the Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson and others as caving into blacks, as favoring blacks over whites. And so they moved as a group into the Republican Party. That's true. Became the white party with a handful of brainwashed brown, black, and yellow people, a very small number. But the Democratic Party became a party where approximately 37% of the makeup of the party would be white, over 90% of blacks. In the case of Barack Obama, 96, 97% in his first term voted for him. And in this last election, 87% voted for Biden. So this would become a party made up of blacks and whites, brown, red, and yellow, but whites as a minority. And the majority of whites, 58% now, supporting the Republican Party. So he gets it right on what happens to the Republican Party. What happens to the Democratic Party is more complex and in part accounts for Trump's defeat, because blacks are the key to his defeat. We have the strongest base inside the Democratic Party that wields a solid vote. But then also, in this case, 66% of Latinos voted for Biden, which normally would have been 70%, and around the same percentage of Latinos, Asians voted for Biden, which was again a little lower. It had been 70% before. So he cut in 3 or 4%, but not enough to win. And that's in spite of vote rigging, every kind of theft that you could think of. 189,000 Black people stripped of the vote in Georgia. 189,000. Stacey Abrams should be governor, and she's going to run again, and hopefully she will be. But blacks so overwhelmed the elections that Biden had a win, and then now we have the Senate having shifted by one vote because the Vice President, Kamala Harris, will have the deciding vote now as president of the Senate. So the strategic power of blacks again produced some victories. The question is, where will that end up? And what do we do to put pressure on this administration to see that it produces some policies in our behalf, and to realize that the main power of Black people is not the vote, it's in the streets, it's in organizing. Without Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives Matter, it's very unlikely that Biden would have won, because that movement not only energized Blacks to get out and take an active part in politics, but it won over a section of whites, Asians, Latinos, especially youth. And that activizing put us in a better position when it came to electoral politics. But the real battle, just as it was in the 60s, where our battles were won largely in the streets, that's true today. And so when we look then at these foundations, in the case of the Liberty Lobby. The Liberty Lobby becomes a think tank that plays a role in the Reagan administration in putting into place a number of people who occupy high positions in the Reagan administration. But as important as the Liberty Lobby was, far more important has been the role of the Heritage Foundation in the Trump administration. Trump, when he was about to assume office, had already had a cabinet and a lot of lower level officials picked by Christie, governor of New Jersey, and he was ready to assume office with a largely fully assembled team. But Gerard Kushner, his son-in-law, convinced him to deep six those recommendations because Christie had put his father in jail for crimes that he deserved to be put in jail for, and has since been pardoned by Trump. And so Trump ended up without a cabinet. And so he had to go somewhere. And so he went to the Heritage Foundation mainly. He went to others as well, but the Heritage Foundation provided him with most of his cabinet choices. And Betsy, one of the women who actually financed him for president, one of the few that actually financed him, Rebecca Mercer, who has funded the Heritage Foundation to the tune of $500,000 a year. She, along with the Heritage Foundation, plays the major role in picking the people who make up not only the cabinet, but many of the administrators that run Trump's administration. And so Betsy DeVos, who ended up being Secretary of Education, who is a major funder of the Heritage Foundation, extremely rich woman, becomes Secretary of Education. Mick Mulvaney, Rick Perry, Jeff Sessions, who was Attorney General until he got kicked out by Trump. And over 66 Heritage Foundation members have made up the Trump administration. And there's been one and only one criteria for them being a part of this administration, and that is that they're ideologically right-wing. They do not have to know anything about the agency, because the agencies they've been sent in to run, they've been sent in to dismantle. So if they go into the Environmental Protection Agency, it's to destroy environmental standards that will protect the environment. DeVos has done her best to promote charters, which she's a leading proponent of, and to work against educational policies that will benefit students of color and everybody else. So that's the wing of the right-wing movement that is mainstream. And in the case of the Heritage Foundation, it still exercises considerable support. Now, when we get into the militia groups, the armed militia groups, according to the Center for Southern Poverty, in 2019, 576 groups could be listed as anti-government groups. Of these, 181 were militia groups. Now, this is down from 216 in 2018. The reason that the number's down is because they've had a president that's been on their side. And so while they feel great support coming from this president, at the same time, they don't have the incentive to organize that they had before. The main incentive for organizing this new right wing, especially made up of the Boogaloo Boys, formed in 2010, the Three Percenters, founded in 2008, and the Proud Boys, founded in 2016. The main incentive for the organization of these right-wing groups has been the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. And that led to a severe crisis of dispossession. Because if the Black freedom movement could lead them to feel dispossession because Blacks got the right to vote or some rights to jobs or something under civil rights laws, then what kind of problem do you think it posed for the psychology and mentality of a lot of whites, and particularly these extreme right-wing militia groups, when a Black man's elected president? I mentioned this before. My wife knew someone in Britain, a white guy, who said that for the 8 years of Obama's presidency, he couldn't sleep. So the occupancy of the presidency gave fuel to the fire, and the right wing had a cause that they could organize behind, because based on that cause said that they had been truly dispossessed and that they were going to have to take their country back. If we note the campaign of Trump, the campaign of Trump was based in 2016, and this last campaign was based on immigration, anti-immigration. When he came down the gilded stairways, fake gold, in the Trump Tower, and he bellowed out, "The Mexicans are coming. They're rapists, they're robbers, they're murderers." And then he said, "And a few of them are good." That's the Gemini in him. He's trying to tell you, well, I'm not a racist. See, I said some of them are good. He pointed to a major fear that had become magnified by 2016, which was the fear of immigration. When the right wing said that they felt dispossessed, the primary dispossession was the victory that Blacks scored in the 50s and 60s, but the growing sense of dispossession coming from the influx of Latinos and Asians primarily into this country, brought about through the 1965 Immigration Act. Blacks didn't call for that, but it was the spirit of the Black freedom movement that put the leading people in power in the position of saying that they really can't stand by a policy that says the only people who can come into this country are white. Little did they expect that there would be a stream of brown and yellow people coming into this country. Of course, Blacks have not been allowed to come in at the same numbers. So anti-immigration has fueled this new right wing, and particularly the armed militia, but both wings of it. And they feel dispossessed because they realize, and by 2016, this had set in, that this country will not remain majority white. And that means that the primary leg of white power is broken, because the primary leg of white power in this country has been based on numerical supremacy. The fact that whites have been the overwhelming majority in a white settler colony, mainly by wiping out Native Americans and keeping Africans and Native Americans divided among each other. And as I pointed out before in Bacon's Rebellion, making sure that whites identified with their whiteness, and while their stomachs might be empty, they could say, "I'm free, white, and 21. Free for what? you know? So when we look at the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Three Percenters, and others, these are major focal points that inspire their organizing. And we've seen with Black Lives Matter movement, the way in which Proud Boys have gone in and infiltrated them, and in the very beginning, burned some Black businesses to make it look like Blacks had somehow done this. This was to spur a conflict between Blacks and the police. And, we've seen that intervention of these groups, and particularly the Boogaloo Boys, in their participation in various movements that have gone on in this country, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, being present. They want to create chaos that can lead to some kind of overthrow of this government. So the key point about the white right wing, the militant armed right wing, is the bulk of that seeks the overthrow of the government. And what we saw in the Capitol, which was a large body of whites that had come to the Capitol, called to the Capitol by the President of the United States, purportedly to challenge the Electoral College vote and to get the votes in states that had been shifted by Black votes and brown and red votes and yellow votes to be turned around, because in their mind, we shouldn't be voting anyway, So this rally that was purportedly about trying to influence the Electoral College, which of course is not possible, it's influenced by votes. And Trump had lost the election, and by a landslide. But for many militia groups, this was their opportunity to do a lot more. And the FBI, the police, they knew this, because on their servers, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, they were saying what they were going to do. They were going to come and occupy the Capitol. They said so. And some of them came with Molotov cocktails, some of them with weapons. And as we've seen, when you look at the footage now, some of the Capitol Hill police actually let them through. That is, the barricades, they let them get past the barricades. In some cases, Capitol Police were trying to push them off, but they were ill-manned to be able to handle that. They didn't have any equipment, they didn't have anything. And it's clear that some of these right-wingers, militia and others, got into the Capitol itself, into areas in which you have to be guided to know how to get through, because there's all kinds of underground tunnels and everything else. Some of them even got into offices of representatives whose names were not even on the wall, because these were the offices that they could retreat to and hide out. And so they had to be guided in some of that. And then the spectacle of some of them sitting in the speaker's chair and in the chair of the person, Mike Pence, who was presiding over announcing the vote for the Electoral College. And in fact, things were so disorganized that the actual boxes that contained the votes were nearly left in the Senate chamber. And had those been destroyed, you would have had to go back over the vote counting again. Two ladies had the good sense to carry them out. So I think in terms of right-wing history, particularly militia history, this is going to go down for them as a major moment in their history, where they symbolically attempted the overthrow of the US government, symbolically. There's nowhere in the world they were going to be able to pull that off. But the thing is, this is symbolism. The woman that was murdered, or not murdered, but shot when she tried to enter the Capitol, breaking into the windows and whatnot, she's probably going to end up being a martyr for this movement. They're going to use this to rally and organize. So now if anyone thinks that this movement is over, you got another thought coming. And unless they impeach Trump in both houses and deny him the right to run again, it's very likely he will run again. So the issue for Blacks is this, and the issue for people of color, the issue for anybody that's got any insanity is, we need to understand that we have an initiative going. That initiative has shifted not only the presidency, but has created a global movement. But that initiative has got to be able to also secure the lives of the people who are engaged in those struggles. Just as we did in the 60s, we had groups that provided that support. Now, we also need to see that Black lives are protected, that Black lives are not put in harm's way. And so in our communities, we need to be looking out for securing our own lives and looking out for protecting them. Because I think it's predictable that with the defeat of these forces, they'll be striking out. But it's also predictable that we have the initiative, and what we need to do is organize. And I really want to stress the main emphasis in organizing isn't on guns. The main issue is on organizing people. And we need to build power in our communities while we protect what we build. This is not like the 1860s and 1870s and 1890s and even later, where you have something, some whites can come in and take it. Try it now. That ain't going to happen. If they try, then we have to be in a position to protect whatever it is that we build, most importantly, our families and our communities. So organizing has got to be like the key agenda, but to organize the body, we got to organize the minds. And we need to free the minds of a lot of our people whose minds are still captured. And the violence that's going on in the Black community that a lot of us don't want to touch on, that was brought on by the intelligence agencies putting drugs in our community, brought on by jobs being taken out of the country, and by redevelopment agencies breaking up Black communities and destroying Black businesses and creating an economy that we didn't want, which was a drug economy and a culture that has been threatening to our community, which is a drug culture, along with the corporate culture, which is even more dangerous. So these are forces that we have to reckon with and that we have to deal with. But the most important thing we need to realize is this: the biggest threat is not the right wing. The biggest threat is not the armed militia. The biggest threat are those who control the levers of power in this country that have willed it that the rich will get rich and the poor will get poorer, and more people will be expendable. That is the big threat. And that threat today is called neoliberalism. That is privatizing everything that's in sight. And so part of the task for Blacks and others who are progressive or radical is to put pressure on this administration to minimize that. But I'm telling you, Biden is a part of that. He is a neoliberal, as Obama was. I was telling people, and I voted for him both times just because that was a movement of our people. But at the same time, we made the mistake of not putting pressure on Obama. We have motion in the ocean now. We need to be putting pressure while we're doing our own organizing and building our own power and building our own communities. We need to be able to control the education in our communities. We need to be able to build up an economic base in our communities. We need to be able to see that legislation is passed so that low and moderate income housing, especially low income housing, becomes again the business of government, so that you don't have homeless people. We shouldn't have people sleeping in the streets. So that what we have to do is address the issues of poverty and inequality and racism and sexism. And that's going to require building power in our neighborhoods. So I just want to conclude this by saying that this is a very interesting period in history. You should realize that you've got some power. But the first power you need to do is wield the power of your mind, and that will control the power of your behind. Freeing the mind is the first task while we're engaged in community rebuilding. So I hope this has been helpful. And by the way, our next show next week will be to commemorate the great hero, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And we'll be showing on the date of his birthday, which will be next Friday, a speech that I delivered in 2001 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called The Militant Legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And this was delivered before 4,000 people in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And it's as relevant today as it was then. This was delivered in the midst of the war against the people in Kuwait. You should check that out. And I have a filmmaker that does work for a number of things. And the film that I said you should look at on Black Power and the defeat of the Confederacy and the Civil War and other victories we achieved, filmmaker Lo Rojan did a lot of professional film work on that with historical footage. The same will be the case with this presentation. A lot of historical footage, Dr. King, and on the movements that our people have led. I try and give you some quality material. I would also like to encourage you, when you come to this program, if you haven't already subscribed, hit the subscriber button. I would also encourage you to encourage your friends to watch the show. And at times we'll have a chance to get your input in terms of how you think we can improve it. But I hope you get the point. I don't just come in here and just run my mouth. I do preparation so that this education is useful for you. So I hope you got something out of that. I enjoy this very much. And I particularly enjoy the opportunity to respond to any questions that you might have. And I'm looking to see if we have any. I don't see, let's see. I don't see any questions up here. One is from John Jackson that says, "Thank you, Baba. I wish I had caught the beginning of the show." And there's a couple of other comments, but I don't see any questions. So what I want to do is thank you for watching this. I hope you get something out of this. And Hotep. Okay, I see a question here before I go. This is from one of our regular listeners. Dr. T'Shaka, what are your thoughts on the strategy of the Republic of New Africa? For people that don't know it, the Republic of New Africa is an important organization in our people's movement for justice and liberation. And it is a movement that basically calls for Blacks setting up a government in some states in the United States. Generally in some southern states. And it's a brother named Imari Obadeli, who has now passed on, a great freedom fighter, and a person who had, along with his brother, provided a forum for Malcolm X in some of his speeches in Detroit, Michigan. So according to Amari Obadelli, the objective of establishing a government in some southern states is a limited objective, and that based on the fact that we're not trying to take the whole country, that it should be at some point achievable. I think he knew that it would take some struggle of various forms. Use your imagination. If Blacks choose to do that, we have a right to. Just as Blacks have a right to leave this country and return home. However, to be realistic, most Blacks aren't going to leave this country and return to Africa. And frankly, my view on the Republic of New Africa position is, while I respect it, I do not think that the attempt to seize even one state can be described as a limited objective. Not as long as America is intact. If America should dismember and break up, well, then possibly that's an option. But if we look at the Civil War shows us that this country went to war against its own brothers and sisters over the issue not of freeing Blacks, but over the issue of maintaining the Union. And if they would fight their own kind for that, I think they would do the same thing today and do it in a fierce way. So if you're going to pursue that, then understand, I would argue that it'll take about the same power to take one state as to take the country. And I'm not arguing that that's going to happen anytime soon. I personally think that King and Malcolm were right. And I think the Black Panther Party had it up to a certain point as right. But King and Malcolm had concluded, Malcolm put it this way: just as a chicken is not designed to produce a duck egg, America is not designed to produce freedom. He said, if a chicken could produce a duck egg, it would be a revolutionary chicken. And if America could produce freedom, it would be a revolutionary system. So Malcolm, at the end of his life, was suggesting system going to have to be restructured. King said very clearly, because at the end of their life, King and Malcolm ended up on the same page when it came to the long-term objective. King said the problem in America is structural. And what he meant was the system is structured to make the rich rich, the poor poor, and to keep Blacks on the bottom and people of color. And so I think that is the objective. And what that means is we have to conceive of those things that must be done to create a just society now, not wait until then. And that's part of what I'm doing. So a lot of my systems are systems to create some justice where there's injustice. The freeing of the mind, 6-fold stages to mental freedom. You really can't free a society if you don't free your own minds. In my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I put forward an idea which is based on African family models. This book is considered a classic for just family models. And I'm not going into that now. I will at another time. But we need to conceive a family model, family relationships between men and women that's balanced and just. And that has to be at the foundation of any society that we create. And there are many other things. So we need not wait until the change occurs to do this. We have to do it now. That is, we have to put in place just systems, test them out and see that they work. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If it's good for us, it's good for everybody else. They don't have to use it, but I'm just telling you, there are a lot of cultures, not just Blacks, in need of just family models. So that's some of it. John Jackson has a question. Have you heard about the group of families in Georgia that 96 acres, that have 96 acres and are establishing their own community. Any thoughts? Vaguely, I don't know that much about that, but I think that any effort to build economic power and to build Black communities is a good move. And we could learn from Blacks who come out of enslavement who formed all Black towns. They understood. They weren't in a position to set up their own nation, because had they been in the Caribbean, they would have probably made that move at some point. But they understood they were going to have a much better chance under a system that Blacks govern. So anything like that, I think, is a positive thing. And I think when it comes to economics, the best move is cooperatives, where we share an ownership. Though if it's private enterprise, if it's doing something positive, I'm not going to knock that either, as long as it's not oppressive. But I think the best model is a sharing model. This is a comment here. Globally building mental success. Kamala Harris and Biden has a life. One white supremacist has already stated, by any means, Biden will not take the office of the president. Okay, what he's saying is that there's been a threat on the life of Kamala Harris and Biden, and they might not be able to assume the presidency. Yeah, that may well be the case. We now know that, but Blacks knew without knowing the facts that Obama was under, and his wife, Michelle, they were under constant threats. And there was an actual shooting through the window of the White House at one point. And so, yeah, it's possible. But I would assume that they'll be assuming the office of president, and I would, and vice president. And I would also assume that they have an urgent task, which is to first address the issue of COVID-19 and to really address it. And I would say to everyone that watches this show, wear a mask, do social distancing. This is just minor stuff. It's a lot more that should be done. Countries that have really dealt with this seriously, like China, Taiwan, the Caribbean, the death rates are low. But in a country like this that is politicized, what is a deadly viral crisis, they have just contributed to death. So, take whatever measures you have to. And I would suggest you take the vaccine too. And I know people's reservations on this because the health systems in this country, including the way they've treated Blacks who have caught the COVID, Blacks and brown, we are the ones that are dying at the highest rate. And one reason is some of us can't even get admitted to hospitals. And it was something that came up on Facebook and the internet, where a sister who is a medical doctor was complaining about racist treatment. And the hospital staff said they felt offended by her complaints, and she died. And that's a doctor who knew what kind of treatment she should have been getting and was denied that treatment. So I don't have any great faith in the medical establishment in this country. There's really no medical system here. It's all private. But I would say that if you're going to have herd immunity, you're going to have vaccinations. And these vaccinations have apparently had 96, 97% effectiveness. Had we been in the era of polio where there was no vaccine for it, I think I'd be all but a fool that wouldn't want to take it. And if people didn't want to, I think they almost shouldn't have a choice in that case, because if they get it and they can spread it, they don't have the right to do that. And I'm not somebody into imposing anything on anybody. But in this particular case, we need to take measures. Take the measures you have, because you only get this life once at a time. You don't want to lose it any sooner than you have to. I think that's it. So thanks for the questions. And I hope you got something out of this. I enjoy doing this. It's a lot of work, but it's worthwhile. So I want to say to all of you, Hotep, until next week.